Thank you, Doug. Bonjour à tous. I'm not Trevor Farrow. I'm Andrew Pilliar. I am the Research Director of the British Columbia Access to Justice Centre for Excellence. Trevor Farrow, Dean of the Law School at Osgoode Hall, is unfortunately not able to moderate today, so you get me instead. But it is a great honor for me to be able to introduce our panel today. And the hope for this first session, which is no longer, there we are, which is what would it take towards a national strategy for access to justice data, is to really open things up and to get us thinking about what are the possibilities, what are some challenges in moving towards these things that we have heard about already, things like justice as a common good. What would it mean to move towards people-centered justice? How do we create and sustain a movement toward this over time? So on the stage, I am going to introduce first to my immediate right, your left, is Paul Aderman. Paul is the former chair of the Social Security Tribunal of Canada from 2018 to 2023. And Paul now offers counseling and training, consulting and training to tribunals, regulators, and government. And Paul has a deep interest in access to justice and did some very significant work with the Social Security Tribunal on developing understandings of access to justice within the tribunal system. To Paul's right is Lucie Léonard, who is director of the Canadian Centre for Justice and Community Safety Statistics with Statistics Canada. Lucie is a criminologist who holds a master's in criminology from Université de Montréal and has worked in criminal justice and crime prevention for more than 20 years. To Lucie's right is Jasmine Redfern. Jasmine is the chair of the Nunavut Human Rights Tribunal since 2021 and has been was appointed to the tribunal in 2017. Jasmine is a graduate with great distinction of the Nunavut Law Program and has over 10 years of experience in social policy and programs with a focus on Indigenous women, youth, and 2S LGBTQ+ communities. And last but certainly not least is Owen Ripley, who is the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister and heads the policy sector at the Department of Justice. Owen previously worked for over 12 years at the Department of Canadian Heritage, where he spearheaded policy work related to the impact of digital technologies on arts, culture, and media. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with a few, I'm going to help move us through some questions, and we're going to riff as we go. We're going to try and keep this fun, and there's going to be time for questions as we go. A starting point, I think, is, what are we here to do? What are the problems that we're actually trying to solve? In other words, what do we mean by access to justice? And before that blows everybody's mind by starting with the big question up front, I'm going to ask Owen to start us on this, simply because I understand that the Department of Justice has been engaged in a project, and Owen has a PowerPoint on this. Do you have a clicker yet? I haven't handed you a clicker. There. I'm going to hand you a clicker, and then, all right, and then maybe we can riff off answers to that question through the other panelists after Owen's presentation.
Hey folks, so the first thing we said in our prep call was we don't want this to be a boring panel where we all get up and do PowerPoint presentations, but I got some special dispensation to share some stats and data with you, because I think this is a stats and data conference, and so let's dive in. I don't need to tell the folks in this room that people-centered justice, in contrast with system-centered justice, starts with the legal needs of those impacted rather than the perspectives of justice institutions and its actors, and the Attorney General just spoke to that. Legal needs research asks individuals about serious legal problems they have experienced, whether and how they try to resolve them, and the financial, physical, mental, and social impacts of these experiences. Many of these problems never actually make it into the formal justice system, as you know. Yet these problems cost us all, and many people need assistance to resolve them. We've been really excited to be working closely with the OECD on the economic value of investing in people-centered justice. Canada is one of several country case studies that are looking at the social and economic impacts of unresolved justice problems, as well as the potential benefits of adopting a more people-centered approach to justice. And so we are really pleased that they gave us special permission to give you a sneak peek at some research and data that will be coming out later this year. And so I'm going to just share some of that with you this morning. And so the case study on Canada first estimates the incidence of justice or legal problems in Canada. And then the next step is to map individuals' pathways to resolution. And then finally, as a final step, researchers are quantifying the direct and indirect costs borne by individuals, the justice system, and society as a whole. So kind of the social cost of these legal problems. Estimating the incidence of justice problems. So the starting point, and maybe to ground today's conversation, based on 2025 National Justice Survey data, 39% of Canadian adults faced at least one serious and difficult to resolve legal problem over the last 3 years. I know that maybe some of those numbers may be pretty small for you, but if you can pull out your glasses, you'll see that the most common problems that people face in Canada are property crime, violent crime, medical treatment issues, and then discrimination. So property crime's at the top there with 17%, violent crime 8.8%, medical treatment is 5.6, I think that says, discrimination 4.0, and then it goes down: employment, housing, debt, money issues, consumer, will execution, family, domestic violence, injury at work. When we turn to dispute resolution mechanisms, we see that they are used in a relatively small proportion of civil justice problems. And so in the case of civil justice problems, only 18% of such issues reach some sort of dispute resolution problem. You do see significant variation by problem type. So for example, family law issues are the most likely to reach a dispute resolution mechanism at 42%. You compare that to 14% for discrimination cases and just 5% for medical legal issues. And then at the bottom there, you'll see the criminal law issues, so property crime, 27%, and violent crime, 23%. Turning now to resolution rates. So the study is also looking at the share of people who experienced a serious legal problem who resolved it by the time the survey was done. And here we see that 29% of serious civil justice problems are resolved. Resolution rates are extremely low for issues related to property crime and violent crime, and they reach their highest for cases concerning will execution. So again, you see at the top, I know it's hard for you folks to see, but will execution is at the top there at 46%, employment at 37%, housing 35%, family 32%, injury at work, I think that's 26%, debt, money issues 25%, and it goes down with, again, the criminal law issues, violent crime at 12%, and property crime at 6%. Now, this is an interesting slide. Which is data on the likelihood of certain population groups reaching resolution to their justice problems. And it highlights the stark disparities for crime victimization for visible minority and Indigenous people. And it also highlights the stark disparity for people with less education or lower income. And so you see there that, for example, when it comes to crime, property crime, violent crime, minorities are negative 55%, negative 70% compared to the baseline data. Indigenous people, negative 55%. And so you can see and highlights the barriers facing certain segments of the Canadian population. And finally, and this is the last slide, and then we're going to get into the conversation, this table estimates the personal cost to individuals experiencing these justice problems. It also includes the cost for third parties, such as employer costs related to loss of productivity and broader social costs felt by family and neighbors. And the total there down in the bottom, red circle, estimates that the costs amount to more than $57 billion per year. And I think what's interesting about this slide, and this kind of moves into the conversation, is the costs are different, right? So if you're looking at the public costs, they're highest when you're dealing with the criminal justice problems, which makes a lot of sense. But when you're looking at personal costs, right, the highest personal costs they are associated with a legal problem is medical treatment issues. So that's interesting. Then you have issues of injury at work. And so I think it highlights, and maybe I'll leave this, and the disclaimer is OECD is still refining the data, so you can't cite it yet. It will come. But maybe where I'll leave it and then turn it over to my panelists to kind of react is, I wanted to ground this conversation in what are we trying to achieve with a national data strategy. And I've shared these stats because I think they should help us reflect on, ultimately, we are trying to figure out what policy intervention or program intervention would be the most effective at moving the needle on some of these data points, right? So what are going to be the interventions most effective at increasing access to dispute settlement, right? Like if we go back, it was like 18%. How do we move that number higher? What interventions are going to be the most effective at increasing the resolution of legal problems, especially without engaging the formal justice system? So again, there was not one legal problem that hit 50% resolution rate. How do we move the needle on that? Which interventions are going to have the, focus on the highest incidents? So we saw the highest incidents. That means these are the problems Canadians are encountering day in, day out. That was property, violent crime, medical treatment, and discrimination. Maybe we should focus our energies there, as well as those on the highest costs, right? So again, and those don't overlap necessarily. Highest costs, medical treatment, injury at work, family, domestic violence, violent crime, and property crime. And then finally, what are the strategies we're using to address the disproportionate impact and cost of legal problems on certain communities, Indigenous communities, Black communities, people with low income and low education? So I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you, Owen. And now I said that I'd give each of you a chance to answer the question, but I also want to give you a chance to respond to what Owen has just put up on the slides. And I want to say congratulations and thank you for presenting that information. It's wonderful to see. Can I say that this is a room of aspiring data nerds? Is that friendly territory? Yeah, okay, well. And I think having access to something to talk about numbers helps to ground the conversation in a very meaningful way. So I'm going to start with Paul, and then Lucy, and then Jasmine, I'm sorry, and ask you to any response to the slides that Owen's put up, or also your thought of what are you going to be thinking about over the next 2 days in terms of what are the important issues in access to justice that we should be thinking about?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind from my own experience, and then looking at the data that was put up there, is that we have a fairly narrow definition of what the justice system is, and that is it's we focus on the courts and the tribunals who make decisions in the thousands. But in the world that I'm used to, there are government departments, Canada Revenue Agency, ESTC, immigration, health bureaucracies, who adjudicate rights and benefits in the millions. And they don't see themselves as part of the access to justice debate. They're not engaged in that. And their first line of business, in the case of CRA, is to do your taxes, not to adjudicate disputes over taxes. But that happens to be one thing which they do. And so sort of broadening the definition of what constitutes the justice system so that there's a concentric circle outside of, beyond the courts and tribunals, I think is a useful way in trying to prevent some of this stuff happening. Because, litigation, going to court and tribunals is expensive and generally a stupid way to pass your time.
But this is not a stupid way to pass your time. I'm just going to point out. Lucy.
Okay. Is my mic on?
You're
okay,
good.
perfect. Okay, not to add kind of a gravity, severity to the great introduction from Owen, but at the same time, just if we talk from official statistic of physical assault, sexual assault, we know that most of the people don't report it. So let's say 90%. So just to, on top of what's not litigated or resolved, so most of the people don't even report that. And from the latest victimization survey, at least from survey of perception of safety in public and private spaces, like now we're saying 44% of Canadians have experienced a sexual or physical assault. So the rates are very high. So the conversation there too, in terms of just who reports to the authority and why. And then again, I think it's a theme that we'll discuss as well here in terms of trust and institution as well, which again intertwine with the conversation we have with access to justice. So it's a trust that people have as well as the institution to report or not some of those criminal offenses. And as well in terms of the experiences that people might perceive when they report the experiences to the institution. And that's where in terms of the data and the measurement, the idea for us is to, are we measuring the right things, not just from an institutional perspective, but also from a people and live experience. And that's why I think the challenges that have been raised more and more around the measurement and the outcomes that we portray do not reflect well the realities of whether the victims or if we talk, as Paul rightly mentioned, what's around the justice system. Because a lot of people would say the justice system is where people end up where other systems have failed, really. So again, I think there's a room, there's opportunity to look at different type of data, different type of information to better understanding the experiences that people have with the justice system.
Thanks, Lucy. You remind me, we heard last night that it's possible to talk about law and miss justice. And I've heard before, it's possible to talk about data and statistics and miss the heart of what really matters with an issue. And I think that's an ongoing thing. Jasmine, over to you.
Am I on? Yes. Okay, yes. Along with what Lucy's saying, that lands very heavily for me, that we are doing such a poor job at resolving existing disputes in front of us, existing legal issues. And that represents such a tip of the iceberg because we know that so many people are not engaged within the existing legal systems. And drawing links to what we heard from our keynote this morning, that again represents a small fraction of people's experiences of injustice that they would like support in resolving. That's just, we're already doing so poorly at resolving what fits neatly in our existing boxes, knowing that there are so many more people whose legal issues or justice issues fit into those boxes, but for various reasons aren't in front of us. And that again is still a fraction of the people who are experiencing injustice and could use support to resolve those situations. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it's distressing.
So, I mean, obviously, this is a big issue. This is something that hopefully this is the first of many of these types of conversations and conferences to move things forward sustainably. But I'm curious, you know, Owen, if we see this as almost the tip of an iceberg, as you mentioned, Jasmine, what has made progress so difficult? What has made progress in this space as difficult as it has been? And I'm happy to go to whoever wants to respond to this one first. But Owen, since you were the first one and the last one to speak.
Well, I mean, I think some of my panelists who've been in the space longer might have thoughts on this. You know, I think firstly, right, like we're about, 20 years in now and kind of the pivot to really unpacking what people-centered justice means, right? And so obviously that was the first kind of bit, is actually understanding a little bit what Jasmine was saying, like a problem doesn't start at the courthouse door, right? The problem has existed for a long time before it gets there, if it ever gets there, right? And so, you know, if we're going to we're going to talk about that, you actually have to be able to, measure what people's problems are and what are the pathways that they're pursuing to resolve those problems, right? And focusing just on the nuts and bolts of how many cases, are in a particular court or tribunal and resolution rates isn't going to be sufficient. So that's the first piece. The second piece, I've been in this job now, I'm about 20 months, and, from day one, I have consistently heard the refrain of data, we need, better data, and it is challenging in Canada, and, Attorney General Downey spoke to some of the challenges within Ontario and getting systems aligned and the infrastructure in place to just get the, 6 Ontario courts being able to talk to one another. Right? You multiply that in the Canadian Federation, it's complex, and Lucy will tell you, right? Like, we cannot give you a national data set unless we have 13 willing partners who can work with us to do that, right? And so that's challenging. I think, when we had our prep call, right, one of the points, and you and I have talked about this, Andrew, I think we also need to perhaps accept that, like, StatsCan isn't going to be the answer to all these problems. There is a lot, I think, that the folks in this room can do, right, in terms of actually starting to put a measurement framework in place. So, my plea is, like, let's get on with perhaps, some civil society partnerships, in certain jurisdictions with government, with, tribunals, with other, academic organizations. And, it may not be this gold-plated StatsCan data, but at least we'll start to be able to put some contours around these problems. And so that would be my plea.
So I'm tempted to shut this down, and we'll all just do a work party, and everybody in this room will begin doing the things that Owen's just suggested, but maybe not. And Paul, I think, do you want to say something in response to that?
Sure. I mean, I think Owen makes a good point about, how rudimentary data around, case volumes and resolution rates is insufficient. I would say, can we at least do that? This is a problem. I think it's a problem of culture in the justice system. And maybe I sort of put it this way: I'll ask you by a show of hands, who amongst you likes to be held accountable? I see you, yeah. But I think this is, this is at the root of it. We have a great system of accountability for adjudicating individual cases. Canada should be, justifiably proud of that. In terms of accountability for operational performance by courts and tribunals, nothing. And I think that's outrageous. I think at least with the tribunal system, the Supreme Court of Canada has told us, well, we're part of the executive branch. The rest of the executive branch is held to account. But we don't have a systematic framework for even assembling the basic stuff, like, service standards, processing times, that is applied universally. And that's the kind of thing which, from a legal perspective, could be done pretty much with the stroke of a pen. I think that's the sort of thing which, I'll give you an example from my own experience. When I was the chair of the Social Security Tribunal I started, the tribunal was in terrible shape. I got a mandate letter from the minister, and the mandate letter from the minister said, I'm not going to tell you how to decide cases. I'm not going to mess with your adjudicative independence. But you need to build a system that is people-centered, that's intelligible, that's fast, that works for people. And, that was great from my perspective, because I could go to the members who decide the case and say, look, this is what we're doing. I could go to the staff and say, look, this is what we're doing. I could go to the stakeholders and say, look, this is what we're doing. There was a political legitimacy behind that. And it was just, now it gets a little bit more complicated with the constitutional status of courts and that sort of thing, but you can do it with tribunals. I think you could probably do it with courts too.
Lucy, I wonder, putting your statistician's hat on, are there other challenges? Does this siloing, does it have to be this way? Are there ways around it?
Yes. Well, I mean, we know it's not that there's no data around in terms of even understanding the key, but it's the delays. And of course, it needs a lot of infrastructure investment, let's be honest. And that would be a lot of money. But let's say to modernize the courts and tribunal to, let's say, more even of a automatic system. I'm not sure some of them it's even on paper. So just that, but I think I'll leave this for the jurisdiction to look at, because even us also at the national level, there's things we can do to improve our system. But clearly there's an issue there in terms of just being more interoperable and then just more timely as well to gather this data across the country. And I agree with Owen in terms of other to be involved, whether it's academics, civil society, different NGOs. And this is where maybe there's a plea to be done with some of these NGOs. We know that they need to deliver the services, but at the same time, some key information would be very useful for everyone, whether you're providing services to domestic violence victims or to gather some of the information so we know who are the people going, if there's not enough services. So this is all very key information. So if we don't have it, then we rely just on what the system does, but not the services. So this is what I think we need to change. Just us, I know, like, technically speaking, we do more information just from an institutional perspective, but maybe more from the service and the people's experience. So if we add this information, we could have a broader understanding of what's happening and better reflect the reality of
And if I can just come in on that. So, program data is a rich source of data, right? So, department, many different programs working with various justice system actors. Attorney General Downey spoke about community justice centers and the decline in recidivism you see. We know that because it's coming out of the program data associated with those community justice centers, right? The one point I would make, though, is often recipients of funding, particularly of their frontline services, are not necessarily they're not necessarily in the business of data, right? They're focused on delivering frontline services. And I think there's a real opportunity, and this is what I mean about partnerships, is, I think you'd have a lot of willing partners if you could find someone to come in with them and say, you focus on delivering the frontline service, but we're going to make sure that we're actually supporting you and capturing the data that you need and the broader system needs to know the effectiveness of that intervention. And we don't see that, right? And so again, there's a huge space in the space of grants and contributions to have those kind of partnerships where, again, you have somebody who has a data expertise or research expertise partnering with a frontline service and saying, we're going to do this together. You focus on delivering the service and we'll focus on actually measuring the effectiveness of it. Nothing prevents that kind of application.
So I want to hold this moment and just mention to everybody in the room who is in a position to collect and analyze data or need somebody to collect and analyze data, when we're outside talking, that might be an opportunity. This might be a moment, right, to take that. But Jasmine, I wanted to come back to you because I think there's something else that was circulating in the earlier conversation. We talked, different metaphors, but the tip of an iceberg, but also this sense that there, as happy as we may be that there is a beginning of data coming together, and why not? Let's do it, absolutely. But also, what is the other stuff that's out there? What about when we're thinking about people who never come in contact with the justice system or come into contact with the justice system for reasons that they do not want to be there? And I wonder if that connects to things like social determinants of health or justice and thinking about things systemically that way. I wonder if you have any thoughts in that area.
Absolutely. So thinking about social determinants of justice, which is an imported concept from social determinants of health, it's an understanding that people's lives are complex and complicated, and that the fundamental issues in someone's personal life affects their ability to interact with our institutions. And from a data perspective, we have so little of that. We don't have anything that gives us an indication of people's distrust in our systems. We have nothing to indicate what people's quality of interpretation services are and their ability to then understand and engage with the institutions or services that we're providing are. There is so much more than just institutional activity or interactions that we can and should be monitoring and evaluating to determine how to best to make our systems truly people-centered. Because when we talk about people-centered, it's easy for that to become a soft concept as opposed to something that we rigorously integrate and interrogate to ensure that when people show up in our systems, that we aren't asking them to some way fundamentally adapt their experience to fit. That we are instead supporting them through their experience and recognizing that even if we're only able to help them with a single issue, that they are likely experiencing many concurrent issues, and that for them, these are not isolated. They are a global experience in that moment.
Thank you. I think this sets us up to maybe move into another big question, which is, if we're imagining what would it take, what does success look like? What does success in moving forward in a meaningful and sustainable way towards people-centered justice? What does success look like for you? And just as a warning, Paul, I'm going to start with you on this one, and then I'm going to move down this way. This doesn't have to be a full answer, but what comes up to your mind when you think of success?
Well, just to pick up on what Jasmine was talking about, I think we have like to bandy around the term, user-centered design, but I don't think that we have a good sense of what the rigor of that discipline actually entails and how to go about doing that. I mean, so that is a base of knowledge, I think, that needs to be built. I'll come back to what I mentioned before. I think, to create an institutional framework for accountability, certainly for tribunals, I think also for courts, would be a measure of success. And I think it's also important to start to question some basic assumptions. As Attorney General Downey pointed out, maybe we shouldn't be designing systems around an assumption that people are going to be represented in the first place. That in turn leads to questions: why are we so addicted to the adversarial system? Like, what's working well about that nowadays? I think we need, and so we've responded to it in a very incremental and gradualist way through things like active adjudication. But I think that's the kind of thing which needs to be thought about in a more profound way, which is, why do we assume that this is the way we should do business?
Thanks, Paul. Lucy? You can't pretend that the mic isn't working.
Add a little bit of time to think about it these days, with different bills that we know we've been challenged in terms of the data. I would say for sure it's more, I'm in not specific order, but for sure there's governance and leadership issues there. Because again, it's not that some of the data is not there, but at least from an institutional perspective, that's why I don't think it's there enough from a people-centered perspective. But just to do the switch, it would require a lot of governance and leadership to be maintained and better established. And then as well, it would be like exploring different, again, sources of information. So us, we have a lot, for example, of administrative data that, again, would tell you about the case processing, timelines, and we don't do a great job there. So, but at the same time, other type of data that we mentioned in terms of the services, experiences, and just also the engagement of the people themselves. So, if we take example of just the bail, for example, it's a big conversation. We're not going to get there, but we don't have a lot of indicators, even right now when we say how we're going to do with the legislative reform from a victim perspective. So, did the victim receive the right information? Were they accompanied in court? Or did they succumb? Because we know sometimes what makes a case collapse or not. Say if we talk about some very hard issues, for example, around human trafficking or these kind of things where we know most of the time the cases collapse. So just that to better understand, and it's like the youth, for example, we do the same. Say what's the experiences of youth with the justice system where we know, again, it's complex, and do they have the right, are they accompanied right to go to this process from a youth justice perspective as well. So I think like exploring different data sources would be important beyond the administrative one. And then finally, I would say is to, again, look at if we talk from Jasmine, like from an indigenous perspective as well, like this is one of the main one where we know there's how to better address the disparities and those questions around equity and access to justice, which again, I don't think we have measurement around that. So again, if we engage with the right population, and as well from also the Black, where we know. So all those vulnerable population, how can we better address equity and overrepresentation issue in what we want to measure? I would say those would be success if we could get those indicators right.
Thank you. Jasmine, over to you.
I think success would look like fewer unresolved legal issues. We'd like to see those columns in Owen's presentation a little larger, at least for many of them.
Much larger.
Much larger. I think greater public trust in our institutions, in our systems, in the services, surrounding services. Increased access and referral pathways so that there's multiple entry points and access points for existing services and legal processes, including culturally responsive and appropriate pathways, and the ability to adapt services so that they are encompassing of someone's entire issue that's presented rather than narrowly defining or scoping what is within our jurisdiction and having the ability to, on consent, provide additional support beyond that. And I think about a specific example for that. The Yukon Human Rights Tribunal had a model where even though their jurisdiction and mandate is narrowly confined to addressing complaints under the Human Rights Act, they have staff mediators. And often when people come to the tribunal, there's been some kind of breakdown. There's been some kind of challenge or issue that has happened. And regardless of whether or not there's a valid complaint under the Act in that, there's community breakdown. There's a loss of dignity. There's a feeling of having been wronged. And so they were allowing for a time people to come and mediate disputes where they felt that some criteria under the Act had been engaged in some way. And so that's why they approached the tribunal for support. And even if it was an invalid, it was found not to be a complaint under the Act, they still supported people through that. And I think that that's such a beautiful way of distilling what the actual purpose of a human rights tribunal is, and being truly people-centered in that way.
I discerned that you used the past tense there, though, so that may not still be going on.
We haven't had a Canadian Association of Human Rights conference in some time, so I haven't had the chance to talk to them.
Owen, to you, what is success in this?
So maybe I'll riff a little bit off what Jasmine was saying. So there's kind of two key indicators that the department keeps an eye on. One is confidence in the justice system, and the other is whether the justice system is fair and accessible. And both hover around 50%, right? That should worry everybody in this room. 1 in 2 Canadians does not believe the system is fair and accessible. 1 in 2 Canadians doesn't have confidence in the justice system. Like, we want to we want to take pride in being a rule of law country, like those indicators aren't positive. And you see why, like the stats I showed you earlier show why, right? And I guess I would just say, like, you transpose some of that into other social systems. Like if you took those stats and put them in the healthcare context, right? 40% of Canadians experiencing a serious medical problem, only 30% like access some sort of like, dispute pathway for that or whatever equivalent is in the healthcare system, right? And then like vast majority go unresolved. Like we wouldn't accept it. We wouldn't accept it in the healthcare system. Like healthcare system has its own problems. Don't get me wrong. But like we wouldn't accept it in that context. And yet, we accept it in the justice system. And I'm sure all the data nerds in the room will quibble, and we can argue about whether the $57 billion figure is accurate or not. It's probably on the low end, right? But like it just shows the cost of what is going into sustaining a system that doesn't have very effective results for the large amount, right? And so we should be saying, well, the system is going to cost us something. Don't get me wrong. That number is never going to go to zero, right? And maybe it needs to be bigger and costs need to be in different columns, but we should be really trying to get the most out of that $57 billion or whatever it needs to be possible, right? And I mean, coming to Paul's points, like, again, it's costing us a lot as a society. That number represents approximately 2.4% of Canada's GDP. And yet, are we getting the value for that?
How are we doing in the room? Are we engaged?
We want their
Are you still with us? Okay. Because I think that's exactly a great place to go. I mean, we've heard some ideas about possible ways to patch things together, possible ways to move things forward. But over to you. I mean, we can keep talking up here, but are there questions? Are there comments from the floor? I'd invite you, if you have them, to move to one of the two mics throughout the room, and we're happy to hear from you. And in the meantime, I'll vamp a little bit, and here we go. All right. Nope, I'm going to vamp. So, I mean, over to, while we're waiting for comments, what would it take? Lucy?
Me, I would just add in terms of, and I think it's a bit along the line that Paul is mentioning, what success would look like is more transparency and accountability with open data portal, for example.
Okay.
We know in the US they have a little bit more of that, even they're more advanced also with the use of AI, which I don't want necessarily to go there.
That's a different
we know in the
conference,
Canadian
yeah.
context there's
It's
a
later
lot
in
of
the conference.
issues, but in the sense of having more data, open data portal, maybe not tomorrow morning, like respecting privacy and confidentiality of the information, understand, for especially criminal court cases. But on the other hand, as soon as the cases are a bit like, kind of the quality control is there, or otherwise at the very aggregate level, like nothing prevents us from doing that, like eventually to be more transparent and have more accountability. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we have some comments. I'm going to ask any questions or comments. Just state your name, and if you have an institutional affiliation that you want, that too.
Rob Lapper, University of Victoria Faculty of Law and Access to Justice Center for Excellence. I'm only up here to stop Andrew from vamping. But no, really. So the title of this presentation this morning suggested a question about how we would actually get to a national justice strategy. And I want to focus on the words national and strategy. And I've really appreciated and really resonated with the comments and the information we've got this morning. What I am wondering, and I share this from kind of local experience in BC, we can all get together at a conference or at a gathering and say, yes, we need to do some work on data, and there are gaps in the data, and yes, we need to talk to these people. And we leave the conference and nothing happens. And that's been the experience for at least 5 or 6 years. How do we get past that here? Where is there going to be the kind of coordination, leadership, and resources necessary to actually build a strategy, which to me implies coordination, on a national level?
Anybody want to take that one?
I can start. And so, I mean, Rob, I couldn't agree with you more. We had that same conversation in our prep call. And I come back to, like, you know, it's a hard question to ask right now about, you know, where the resources going to come from. As everybody knows, every level of government is in a fairly financially constrained environment. But it's why, like, I do think, you know, it's why I made the point about, I think there's a lot that can be done on the basis of partnerships between, you know, government bodies, civil society, academia. And that's where I think we should start. And, you know, I think those can be, you know, whether it's scoped national right out of the gate, I don't know. But you know, the OECD is interesting because I think the OECD study, and again, you know, people will go over the methodology and have views on it, but it does show, like, all that OECD study was drawn from existing Canadian data sources, right? And what I find interesting about it is, so, like, again, the bounds of the problem are there in the OECD study. Like, we see it. We kind of know, like, it kind of defines the problem, right? And then I think the piece that hasn't been done, though, is actually then you need to kind of take those data sources and figure out how are we going to connect them to the data that we have on interventions, right? And so how do you take it to Ontario's community justice centers and figure out whether, you know, they are actually moving the needle on some of those incidences, whether they're moving the needle on some of the costs associated with those problems, right? And I need your help on that, because I'm not a statistician, I'm not a criminologist, but that's what I think we should start to kind of do, right? And so I do kind of think we need coalitions to come together. Like, I can't promise you, like, I wouldn't wait on a level of government to say we're going to kind of champion a big national strategy here. I would start and show what's possible in BC, and then, you know, bring it to Alberta, bring it to Saskatchewan, move westward, right, until you get more and more partners kind of, you know, buying it. It's what we're doing on bail. Like, Lucy kind of alluded to bail. We're trying to get to national data set on bail. You know, there are still jurisdictions recording bail decisions on paper. It's going to be a while before those jurisdictions are able to feed into a national database. But my hope is we will have a handful of jurisdictions that are actually able to report into Lucy in the near future. And then that at least is a starting point, you know, and we can take it from there.
Thanks, Owen. Over here.
Doug Ferguson. Owen, I just want to confirm, it's $57 billion per year is the cost to Canada. You know, that's fascinating, because there have been studies done in other countries, UK, Australia, and the States. They studied, if you invest $1 in legal aid funding, you save anywhere from $2 to $8 in social welfare costs, okay? And governments are constrained right now, as you mentioned, no question about it. But if there could be a study done on the impact on legal aid funding or the Ontario Justice Centres and so on, how much money is that saving government for those investments? That would be a very useful study to take to government, and to take the point about coalition. That's why we're here. We're going to be the coalition. We're going to move this forward. And the recommendations coming out of here will be passed on to governments, and we'll have to push them. Thank you.
Does anybody want to respond to Doug's comment? And if not, I'll go over here.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. Noel Semple, University of Windsor, Faculty of Law. And Andrew, I know you said to save it for another conference, but I just got to ask if the panel members see any potential for artificial intelligence to improve the justice system or our understanding of it.
I was facetious and I misspoke when I said another conference, because obviously there are panels in this conference as well that will touch on AI. But yeah, curious to hear thoughts.
Yeah, I think this is, you know, I come from this tribunal world where, you know, it's pretty atomized, and these are a whole bunch of individual organizations with relatively few resources, and, you know, that is a lever I think, which can be used to compensate for the fact that, you have small organizations with, limited expertise. What you need, I think, to make AI work well is not to be a coder, it's to know the business of the organization and learn how to prompt it and let it do that work that you can't pay for. That's the kind of, but you have these very kind of tentative approaches in government, about using AI and what's permissible and what are we going to pay for. That's a problem. That's holding us back, I think. So the potential is there for sure.
Where I'm seeing AI kind of in the link to research and data, right, which is interesting, is Jasmine was talking about the social determinants. We all intuitively understand those linkages to some extent, but like some folks are thinking about like using AI to scrape judicial decisions to get a much better picture of the linkages between certain demographic, social determinants and the outcomes in judicial cases, for example, right? And that's a great application of AI because it can kind of review that vast body, right, and actually perhaps put some more contours about that. And that's complementing the work that StatsCan is doing and trying to make some of the linkages between kind of personal identifiers and some of the other data points that we know about how people are interacting with the justice system.
Over here.
Hi, Connor Shields. I work with the Social Security Tribunal. I used to be under Paul Latterman. Good to see you again. I'm wondering what the panelists think about timeliness as a data point in terms of these resolutions. For Owen's data sets, they showed resolution rates, not as high as we'd like, but my follow-up question would be about timely resolutions. Because when you're talking about meeting people in their lived experience and their faith in the justice systems, someone might not approach the justice system if they simply don't think they'll get justice in time. People don't have time for years and years-long processes. And Paul touched on briefly, the lack of accountability for providing an operational process that's timely. And I'm just sort of curious about the connection between those people who are not reaching out to these programs, not accessing justice because they have no faith through lack of accountability for a timely resolution.
I think
Everybody at once. No.
Well,
Paul, go ahead.
I think it absolutely matters. I mean, if you're trained sort of in the common law, our obsession is with the quality of, the substantive decision, and the little attention is paid to factors like that. So, for example, when we introduced a Navigator program at Social Security Tribunal, one of the things that we noticed in terms of the changes in behavior is that the withdrawal rate dropped fairly significantly. So if people were helped a bit, they didn't quit. That has obviously has a bearing on ultimately how quickly you get to resolution. But people, for sure, are discouraged if they talk to their acquaintances, their friends, and they're told, well, you're going to be in 2 years, so.
Jasmine, did you want to respond or to mistake a?
Just to agree that it's a considerable issue and challenge, and something I try very hard to stress in our staff and in our adjudicators is people's lives continue. The issue, it just stays present for them. It's not the same way that we close the file, put it aside, and we'll get back to it when we have the time. In my context, sometimes they're still working with the individual who has done something that they perceive as harmful or contrary to the act. And it's the consequence on the individuals involved is far greater than we can actually understand until we are in that situation ourselves. And that has rippling effects on their support systems, that has across the community, that reflects public confidence in the justice system as a whole, so beyond our individual institutions. it's a major issue, and I agree we need greater accountability and adequate resourcing and support to make progress on that issue.
Thanks. I think we have time for 2 more comments. So I'm going to ask if the 2 questions over here, comments, if we can hear both of those, and then I'll put them to the panel.
Okay, my question is with regard to the concept of an open data portal. My name's Kathy Baticki, and I'm a family law lawyer from the Halton region, which is just part of the GTA, I guess. I'm here as part of the Canadian Bar Association's Access to Justice Committee. On behalf of the Canadian Bar Association, I was part of a submission to, I think, the Senate, a committee of Parliament with regard to the budget. And the specific part of the budget was the judicial resources part of the budget, where the proposal was to move 10 judges from one division to a family court division, particularly in Ontario, to allow for a new unified family court in Brampton, Ontario, to be open. And when I was giving those submissions to Parliament, I gave some information that we had about the stats, about the slowness of the family cases in Brampton from about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And one of the questions was, well, what is it like today? Why do you want the Unified Family Court today? And I couldn't give that answer because we don't have that information. I know I'm a dispute resolution officer in the Superior Court of Ontario, specifically in Brampton, and I know that we can move family cases to resolution quicker if we didn't have to worry about criminal cases taking precedence because of the Jordan ruling. We had one situation where we were negotiating cases to try to get them to settle, and if they didn't settle, they were supposed to go to trial the next week. So there's this pressure that you're going to get to trial. And then we were told by the presiding judge that there are no judges available anymore because there were too many criminal cases that had to take precedence, otherwise they would have been dismissed due to Jordan. The concept of the Unified Family Court would take a lot of that pressure away, but I couldn't answer the question to Parliament about what about now? I know that now there are heavy pressures on the court, but I couldn't prove it with the data. This concept of an open data portal, the transparency that we could all access pretty easily, would provide that information that maybe would allow people to move faster towards finding resolutions. So my question is, how can we get that done?
Thank you. And next question.
Hi, my name is Maris Bray. I'm here from the University of Windsor. And I guess my question for everyone is, where are your librarians? Good.
There we go.
Excellent. If you're not talking to your librarians, you're leaving a lot of expertise and a lot of enthusiasm on the table. Because we can work absolute miracles with data and with organization, and we are very collaborative people. So if you want to make things happen, find your local librarian. And if you work anywhere in law, you do have a local librarian. Also, very briefly on the topic of AI, I think we need to be very clear about whether we're talking about generative AI or machine learning AI. Those are very different things, and I think they have very different use cases or no use case in some cases. Thank you.
So obviously we're at the point, we have a minute left, and there is more than we can possibly answer here. I'm going to layer another question on because I think it touches on this, and it's simply this: who should be involved in this who is not already? So who else, either within this room, but who outside of this room should be in this room or should be involved in this? So any of those 3 questions, if you want to take, or just use this for last comment in the seconds that we have left, over to each of you. And Owen, Paul, maybe I'll start with you and we'll move that way.
In terms of who needs to be involved, I think the voice that's not really heard is the voice of users. You know, the logistics of sort of actually coordinating that is very tricky, but that's a problem I think that we have to seriously engage in, finding ways for the people who are affected by the justice system to have a role in designing it. Maybe there are proxies that work. I don't know, but we have to stop doing it from the top down.
Thanks, Lucy.
Yes, so it would be around, I guess, just to look and work harder at the privacy and confidentiality of the information to then allow for again, maybe at a more aggregate level, maybe more imperfect, but to have more of those open data portal and more accessibility to the information with everyone involved, including the user, as Paul mentioned.
Thanks. Jasmine?
I think there's universal agreement that we need more data. My interest in a national strategy is that that has the ability to set the standards for what data we're looking at, how it's captured and collected, and the governance over that data as well. One of the main challenges that I experience is that data without context or adequate context risks misdiagnosing the issue. And so, especially for communities that are underrepresented in rooms like this, it's really important that we always have the additional context to make sure that we understand the picture that the data is trying to paint for us.
So I would double down on the users, although even this conversation has skewed back to users of justice system institutions. And I think like the people who actually need to be in the room are the ones not on this, like who are the people just giving up, right? And why are they giving up? And again, how do you actually design interventions that can resolve those problems so that they're just not giving up on their legal problems? Like institutions are important, but they're the, like, I think again, like to me, that's the last resort, right? And the goal is actually to solve all those problems with recourse as little as possible to the formal institutions. And so yes, the institutions need to be user-centric and user design focused, but we actually need the larger problem resolution systems in place to even, try to prevent them from even getting there. And I think like that's just like that's the missing piece of the conversation.
Well, thank you all. We've opened some conversation here over the next 2 days. We will be breaking for 15 minutes, but before the next panels begin in the 3 different rooms. But please join me for a moment in thanking our 4 panelists this morning.